If you've ever driven an E46 M3, you are familiar with the M clunk. And if you have an E46 M3 over 100,000 miles, chances are you're also familiar with the grinding noise when you make really, really sharp turns, especially when the diff is cold. Now today, we're going to be testing a possible solution for that. There's a company called Racing Diffs. They're here on YouTube as well, and they've showcased their kit that gets rid of the M clunk, which is caused by the free play, and it also fixes that grinding noise that you're going to get when you're making those sharp figure eights. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our E46 M3 as a guinea pig car. We have a whole video on this. It'll be linked down below. You can see this whole aftermath of when we first got this M3 on the road. But it's been sitting for a year because it had issues with the SMG system, which we've already fixed. But now we got to fix the diff so we can actually drive it. That noise is really, really bad. The clunk is really, really bad. Now this diff has about 180,000 miles because it does not belong to this vehicle. So what we're going to do, we're going to pull the diff out and then we're going to put it on the workbench and we're going to take it apart, install the whole Racing Diffs kit, and I'm going to show you guys how to do it, and then we're going to go out there and test it. Now usually I show the full DIY process, but today's going to be a little bit different because I'm not going to show you how to remove the exhaust or the drive shaft, just because this car has been pieced together with a lot of leftover stuff that we had, so it's not fully complete. But I will give you the DIY steps once we get to the actual diff removal side of things. Alright, so we've got the exhaust off and we've got the heat shield off. Now, before we remove the diff, we've got to remove a couple other things. The drive shaft, where it actually attaches to the diff, so this would be considered the input shaft on the diff. And then we have two output shafts on the diff that go to each wheel. So there's a half shaft on each side of the diff. So we're going to remove the one on this side and one on this side. Now all of the bolts are going to be external Torx 12. Now here's the trick. You want to have your car in neutral. That way you can move the drive shaft as much as you want to access all of the bolts on everything. And what we're going to do first is we're going to go around and loosen all of the bolts. And now, since it is in neutral and we don't have the parking brake up or anything, now this is the SMG, so we left it in neutral before we took the battery off and all of that. If you have a 6-speed manual, you're going to leave it in neutral before you, and don't put the e-brake up. So 6-speed, you're going to put it in neutral. For SMG, you're also going to put it in neutral before you take the battery out. Because once you take the battery out, if it's an SMG, whatever gear you were in, that's where you're stuck. So we've got it in neutral all around. Everything should be free. You should be able to turn every aspect of this. Obviously, the half shafts are going to be a little bit harder, but you also want your e-brake down. Now, in order to hold the half shafts and the drive shaft, all that stuff from moving, what we're going to do is the rotors are actually vented. So you're going to put a flathead through the caliper bracket into the vent of the rotor. And you're going to do that on both sides, and that's going to leave the rotor in place. Now you are going to have to turn the drive shaft to access the bolts on the top. Same thing with the half shafts, so you're going to have to access the bolts on the top, so you have to turn them. And now all of these bolts are E12. Once you have those removed, we're also going to have to remove the rear sway bar in order for us to actually drop the diff down. Now you don't have to remove the drive shaft completely, but it does make it a little bit easier. If you don't remove it completely, you're just going to remove it from the input shaft of the diff. So all those 6 E12 bolts, and then you're going to just let it hang, but you want to tie it up so it's not putting too much pressure on the joint in the middle. For us, we're going to remove the entire drive shaft because we need to replace the center support bearing anyways. Alright, so now we are at the point where we're almost ready to remove the diff. But before we can remove the diff, because we're going to actually tilt the diff back and pull it out towards the back of the car as much as we can, so that we don't have to remove the entire subframe. And in order for us to tilt it back far enough, we are going to have to remove the sway bar. You have 2 links, one on each end, and depending on the type of sway bar you have, if you have an aftermarket sway bar, you might just be able to remove it from the link pretty easily. But we have the stock sway bar with the stock sway bar links. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to remove the bracket that holds the sway bar link to that upper control arm. Or you could also call it the spring perch. So we're going to do that on both sides. It's just held in with a very thin-headed bolt and a nut going from the bottom. So we're going to take off, there's 2 on each side, we're going to take both of those off, and we should be able to drop that down. and then we just have a couple of hex bolts holding the sway bar to the subframe. So in order to remove the bracket, you have to hold the bolt from the top. So you can use a wrench and put it on the top. It's a 17 millimeter. On the bottom, it's a 13 millimeter nut. Now, you can use some flex head wrenches. All those things will work. Now, if you really look at the bracket, you'll see that the sway bar link actually bolts into the bracket. And the reason I actually take the entire bracket off is because it's a little bit easier than having to remove the spring and have enough access to remove the bolt that goes all the way through. So this is why I take the entire bracket off. It's just easier, and you can drop off that whole thing. Now this bracket is loose. But it's not going to move down because the bracket on the other side is still attached, and we also have to remove all of the hex bolts to remove the sway bar from the subframe. With the sway bar links detached, we're going to remove the actual sway bar brackets that attach to the subframe. There's going to be 4 6 millimeter hex bolts. You want to make sure that your socket is fully inserted into the bolt. There's probably some dirt and corrosion in there, and you definitely don't want to strip it. Now you're just going to have to guide it out. And since our car is lowered by a lot, it's going to be a little bit more difficult because the axle is going to be in the way. But since we already have it disconnected, you can move that around as well. We had just put new fluid in here. This has less than 2,000 miles on it. That's how you know when your diff is actually filled up. When you release the fill screw, which is the one on the top, you should have a very small, steady stream. And always, doesn't matter what, if you have to change fluid on anything, always make sure you can fill it first before you drain it. So always release the fill screw first. While the diff is draining, we're going to start removing the 3 bolts that are holding the diff into the actual subframe. So there's 3 mounts, 2 on the actual case itself in the back, and then there's 1 in the front that has the big bolt through it. So what we're going to do is we're going to loosen the back ones first. Now we have aftermarket bushings, and usually with aftermarket bushings you're going to have a different bolt that goes there. But for some reason we have the stock bolt still in here, which is an external Torx 14. Now the difficulty with having this bolt right there is in order for you to actually loosen it, you're either going to have to drop the subframe a little bit so you don't actually hit the body, or you can get one of these flex head wrenches, but it just has to be thin enough where it doesn't hit the body. Now, a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll just either dent the body a little bit and just make it happen, or however they could. But for us, this will work just fine. Once you have it loosened up enough, it should just be finger tight from that point forward. All right, so for the front diff mount, it's just going to be a 21 millimeter bolt. This one is going to be on there super, super tight, and it strips fairly often. So when you're actually loosening it, make sure, and by stripping, I mean the actual threads inside of the diff come out. And that's where this one's a little bit difficult, and usually people put Loctite on it if they've replaced the bushing before, but you're just going to want to be very careful when this is coming out. Also need to remove this brace that's in the front of the subframe, right underneath the input shaft on the diff. In order to take off this bracket, we do have to remove the heat shield, which is held in with 2 10 millimeter bolts, which is going to reveal the 1 18 millimeter nut holding that subframe in place. We also need to remove the 4 13 millimeter bolts. There's 2 on each one of these holes. And once again, these are 13 millimeter. Get all those pulled out. Now we're going to need to support the front of this rear subframe before we release these 2 18 millimeter nuts. As you saw when the nuts came out, the actual subframe itself moved down a little bit, and that's why we had that support there. So now that the bracket is out of the way, in order for us to remove this support, we have to put the nuts back in. But that bracket was also acting like a washer and encapsulating that bushing. So we're going to have to replace it with something. We've got aftermarket polyurethane bushings in here, so they're completely independent. It's 3 pieces. 1/2 on the bottom, 1/2 on the top, and then the metal sleeve that goes through the middle. So I've just got these washers. I don't even know what this is from, but this is what we're going to put on here to give that bushing some support. Before we can actually remove the diff, or even that front diff bolt, we are going to support the diff. Now I'm just using a jack here. You can stuff a piece of wood or something, and we're going to just support that front of the diff because this is the only bolt holding it in place. Now this is a 21 millimeter bolt. So one tool that's going to help you once you have the bolt out as far as you can get it without hitting the body is going to be an external Torx wrench. I'll have them linked down below. This one's made by VIM Tools and it's got an E14 on it. So it's going to take a little bit longer, but at least you won't damage your body. And an alternative to the external Torx wrench, once you already have the bolts loosened, you can just use an 11mm ratchety wrench to make everything a little bit quicker. But that's only once it's loosened. If you try to use the 11mm to loosen it, it's not going to happen. You're probably going to end up stripping the bolt. With the final two bolts out, you want to make sure the diff is supported. Now we're just going to angle it towards the back. That's the only way you're going to be able to remove it because the case is so big that it's going to hit the body. And as you're angling it back, make sure you have something supporting it or have a helper. I went ahead and actually washed the differential, pressure washed it just because it was so grimy. We're going to start removing the rear cover on the differential. This is just held in with a bunch of 16mm bolts. And you want to take all of those off, and there's going to be a gasket there, so you might have to use a mallet to beat it off a little bit. The E46 M3 came with two versions of the limited slip diff. The 05 and 06 got the V2, 04 and earlier got the V1. And you could tell the difference by which way the ring gear is at. The ring gear is on the driver's side, which results in the passenger flange having the play. And the passenger flange is going to actually be a little bit shorter than the driver's side flange. So we're going to remove the flanges. You're just going to have to pry these out. There's just a clip that's holding it inside of the differential unit. So you just use some leverage, pop them out, both sides. One's just going to be a little bit longer than the other. It does help to rock it a little bit back and forth as you're pulling it out, just in case if it's tight. Now we're going to remove these side caps. They're all held in with 13mm bolts. Now you'll see the two bolts that are all the way close to the rear opening of the differential that actually have some kind of thread sealer on there, so they're going to be a little bit more difficult to remove. The reason they have the thread sealer is because they actually go into the case itself. Now there's also a shim here on each one of these end caps. You want to make sure you keep the shims with the end cap that it came off of and label them. So this is the right side, so I'm going to label both the shim and the end cap R for the right side. Now onto the left side. Once again, these caps are held on with 13mm bolts. Two of them are going to have thread sealer on it because they go into the case. And when you're taking off these caps, you can actually turn it counterclockwise a little bit and it'll make it easier to pull out. And once again, let's make sure we're keeping the shim with the associated end cap. Now the carrier unit itself is just floating inside of this case. So we're just going to pull that right out. It's not held in with anything. It'll just slide out. Now inside the diff, you can still see the pinion gear that's actually held in with the input flange. We're going to remove that. So the input flange, there's a dust cap that's actually holding the nut in place and it's keeping from all that grease going behind that nut and whatnot. So we're going to pull that out. Once that's removed, now you can actually remove the 32mm nut that's holding the input flange onto that pinion. Now usually if you're just replacing the input shaft seal, you would count how many turns that nut actually has, because you have to put it back exactly where it's at, because you're going to have a crushed sleeve that's setting that preload almost. So in our case, we're going to be replacing everything. So we just zapped it off with the impact and then pulled the input flange out. Now we're just going to move on to the limited slip carrier itself. We're going to try to separate the carrier unit, blow it fully apart, get all of those friction discs, the clutches out and all of that, just to see what kind of, what we're dealing with actually. Now these are held in with 19mm bolts. They're super tight and usually there's some Loctite on them as well. I'm just using my electric impact and popping all of them off. Once you have all the 19mm bolts off, we're going to hit the ring gear with a mallet and just push it off of the actual carrier itself. It should separate fairly easily, and once it has, we can separate the two. Once the ring gear is removed, it's going to reveal these 4 hex screws. Now these are 4mm hex. We're going to remove all of them, and that way we can take the cap off of the carrier unit, and that's where we're going to find all of the clutch disc. Now I'm just using like a mini pry bar, almost like a pick, to separate it. You can use a small flathead or whatnot. There's no seal in here, so you don't really need to worry about damaging the surfaces, but just be careful. You don't want to mar up the surfaces to begin with, and just slowly pry all the way around until that cap pops fully off. Once the cap is removed, now we can start pulling out all of the friction disc and all of the spider gears and everything that's inside of the carrier unit. Now, one thing I like to do is I like to keep everything in order as it's coming out. Just makes it easier for reassembly. But this is something that, as long as you're watching this video, you're going to have kind of somewhat of a reference to put it back together. Now, all of these friction discs, you can see there's a little bit of wear on the actual ones that are in here. I have a feeling that this diff was rebuilt at some point, but these discs are almost all the way through. I mean, there's a good amount of metal that's all over, the whole differential unit, and this one was chattering quite a bit, especially during, sharp turns. Now, I like to keep everything that comes off as a pair. So all those gears on that shaft, I would keep all those together. Even when you're cleaning it, you want to do everything one at a time. And even the spider gears, the very bottom and very top, including this shim. So this shim right here is what we're actually going to be replacing to get rid of that free play. With all that separated, now we can actually remove that pinion gear itself. We're just going to use our press and pop it right out. With the pinion gear out, you can actually see the bearing that's on there as well as that crush sleeve. Before we get to that, let's start taking off the rest of the seals on the actual differential case itself. This is the input shaft seal. You can just use a pry bar or a seal remover to remove it. Inside of there, now you're going to find the actual bearing itself. The cones are actually pressed in, so they're going to stay in the differential, but here's the bearing. Now you can see the cones. There's two cones in here. There's a large one and there's a smaller one. There's one pressed inside of the actual differential, and then the other ones you're going to see from the input shaft side of things. So I'm going to start out by removing the inner cone, the one that's way inside of the differential. The main reason we're doing this is because we can just beat it out from the input shaft side. And in order for us to get to the input shaft cone, to pull that one out, we need to have that big cone removed. So I'm just using a chisel. You can use a punch, whatever you have, and a big enough hammer to push it out. There is a spacer that's between that cone and the differential. So you'll see right here, here's the spacer, and then there's the cone. Now for the input shaft, that cone that's on that side, we're just going to use a bunch of these bearing removal tools, and we're going to use a press to press it out. Now once again, I'm going to have all of these tools linked down below. Some of these are just sockets that I'm using. I'm using impact rated sockets for the most part, but I got to be able to get to that cone. So that bearing removal set that has all these multi-sized flanges almost, that's going to be linked down below. That's from Harbor Freight, and I'll link some from Amazon as well. With all the pressed in cones and everything out, now we actually have to remove the bearings themselves. Now the easiest way to do this is to cut the actual cage. It's going to release all of the bearings, and then you're going to have the race left. We're also going to cut the race, but you don't want to damage the actual part itself. We just want to cut the race off. So on the carrier unit, I put a whole slit across on the race, and then I just used a chisel and popped it out just by hitting it with the hammer. Now you do want to do this slowly, that way you don't damage any of the surfaces, and just keep pushing until it pops off. The reason we cut that slit is to release some of that tension because it is a press fit. You're going to repeat this on all of these bearings. Now remember, you want to cut a very, very minor bit at a time because you definitely don't want to damage the mating surfaces. And just look at the angle that I'm using with the angle grinder, and I also end up using a smaller angle grinder that's air powered with a 3-inch disc to make it even easier. So we have the entire kit from Racing Diffs. I'll have that link down below as well. This comes with all of the clutch stack, comes with all of the bearings, and also comes with all of the seals. Now before we went ahead and started reassembling this limited slip carrier unit, we actually cleaned everything up. You can use whatever you like. Ultrasonic cleaners work the best. You can also just use brake cleaner, and you can also just use some sort of a degreaser in a parts washer, whatever works for you. But we got everything cleaned up. That way there's no metal debris or anything like that anywhere. I'm just separating the clutch stack and getting everything lined up. Just makes it easier for us to reassemble. Now anybody that's driven an E46 M3 has felt the M clunk and has seen the actual free play on the actual flange itself. The free play is mainly because of this shim, and the free play fix is this shim right here. As you can see, the factory shim is just flat. The fixed shim is actually a conical shape, and that conical shape actually just takes up more of that gap that's there and gets rid of that free play. And since it is conical, it can compress, and that kind of also worries me because the contact patch is a little bit less than the flat shim. So eventually I do believe that that conical shim is going to compress and there is going to be free play that's restored. It's just a matter of when. Now this big shim right here goes on the front of that cap. We have the tools to remove that factory shim that's there, but I don't have the tools to compress that new shim. I thought I could probably do it, but I wasn't able to, so we just rocked with the factory one. Now we're on to reassembling all of the carrier unit with all of the new friction disc and whatnot. Make sure you are lubing everything up. Now you want to use the 75W140 Motul competition fluid. I'll have that link down below as well. It's straight blue. It looks like Smurf's blood almost. Now we're lubing everything up because we cleaned everything with brake cleaner and all that's flashed off, so it's all dry. So first we're going to start with that same spider gear, and we're reassembling it the same way it came apart, but we're using this new conical shim instead of the flat one that was there from factory. And once again, this is the Free Play Fix shim. It is important to place it properly. You can see how I've placed the shim. Make sure you're doing it the same way on your end. Now we can reinstall these shafts. Once again, we're going to lube everything up, make sure the washers and the gears go back onto the shaft as well. And these are interchangeable. I'm still trying to put everything back in the same way it came off, so I had everything organized accordingly. When you're putting these on, make sure you lube everything up, and then you want the notch to be facing up because that notch is going to house the other one. Now the one that goes on top is going to be flipped. That way they're both touching each other and interlocked. Now we're just going to have the top spider gear, which we're going to lube up and put that in. And once that's on there, then we just have the locator for the rest of the friction disc and all of that going on top. Now this next shim that goes on top of everything, it does have a conical shape in there, and that conical section needs to be facing down. So you have the very, very flat section facing straight up. You do want to make sure that it bottoms all the way out, so push it all the way through. You might have to move that gear in the middle around a little bit, so that way you can get it fully seated. Now we can start installing the clutch stack. We want to lubricate these one at a time. You're going to alternate between the solid metal section and the one with the actual friction material. The solid metal section is going to have the teeth on the outside of it, and the friction disc is going to have the teeth on the inside of it that's going to slide into that gear. So once again, the metal disc are going to actually have teeth on the outside. They need to line up with the outside splines on the actual carrier itself, and then the friction disc has the teeth on the inside, which lines up with the gear in the middle. I did have some difficulty with a couple of the friction material because one of the tooth was just slightly off in a triangle form. Not all of them, just a couple of them, and on those I did take out my very skinny file and just filed that triangle ever so slightly, just enough to be able to get it to slide in. Now these should be able to slide in pretty smoothly. It shouldn't require any pressure on your end. With the clutch stack installed, now we're going to reinstall the cap. Make sure you're lining up the holes, and this is going to be a very, very tight fit. We're going to Loctite those 4 small hex screws. Once again, these are 4mm hex screws. I am trying to start threading them in from underneath. Now the cap is not fully seated yet, so we're just going to slowly seat it in as we're tightening the rest of the 4mm hex screws and alternating between the two. So once you're tightening these, you don't want to go too tight because this will easily shear. There's not a real torque spec that I have. I just got them tight enough, make sure there was no gap between the cap or the rest of the unit, and just kept going, alternating between each of the bolts until they all bottomed out. I did put some blue Loctite on here so that way it doesn't back out, but we're still going to have the ring gear that keeps those bolts from backing out as well. With the hex bolts fully tightened, now it's time to reinstall the ring gear. Now the ring gear, all of the bolts, I cleaned them up really, really well, and I actually put some red Loctite on the threads. Now some of the threads got a little bit extra Loctite than I was hoping just because my Loctite container is kind of messed up. But we're going to be torquing these down, so we're going to put the ring gear on. Now we're going to make sure all of the holes are nice and clean before the ring gear is going on because Loctite does not do well with any other foreign fluids or debris. So I'm tightening these in a star pattern, getting them all seated at the very least before we torque them down. Now as you're tightening this, the ring gear is going to get seated as well, and the cap is probably going to compress just ever so slightly more. So we're going to put the actual carrier unit inside of a vise, you're going to want a strong vise attached to something very strong, because we're going to be tightening this to 170 Newton meters. So before we even got it on the vise, I tightened it as much as I could by hand. Now we're using the torque wrench and getting it to 170 Newton meters. You do want to go in a star pattern. That way, just in case if there was a little bit of tightness that we didn't achieve by hand, it's going to draw that rest of that ring gear where it needs to be. And as you're doing this, it's always good to just mark each bolt that you've already torqued. That way you can keep going in a star pattern. With the carrier unit fully assembled, now we can turn to replacing all of the bearings and the cones. So we're going to start out with the actual differential case itself. We're going to start off with that big cone for that big bearing that was on the pinion. So don't forget to put this shim in place first. So this is like a spacer shim. This goes in first, and then the cone is going to go on top of that. We're going to take it to the press, and we're going to press that cone in with all of those bearing install tools, the same ones that we used earlier to remove the cones. You really want to be sure that everything is lined up very, very straight. As you can see, my press has a little bit of a bend to it, so I'm going to be adjusting as I'm going through. You might have to do the same anyways, even if yours is not bent, but you want to make sure that it is going in at a perfect angle, because if it goes in diagonally or whatnot, it's going to get stuck and it's going to actually oval out the hole. Doesn't usually happen just because all the materials are really hard, but if it goes in diagonally, then you're going to have a hard time getting it straightened back up. And you don't want to damage the inside of these cones at all, and it's supposed to be a very, very tight fit. Now we got to put the cone in from the input shaft side of the differential case. And once again, we're lubing everything as we go. And the lube is actually going to make it a little bit easier for the actual cone to reinstall as well, even though it's still a very tight press fit. Another thing that you can actually do is a lot of these things, you can find metal that's laying around that's the perfect size or whatnot. As you can see, I'm using this bearing tool. I had to get a different size, that way it fits all the way through. You can also use the old cone to help you push it in. Now you can see everything assembled. You can see the big cone and you can see the smaller cone from the input shaft side. Now with that being said, we are going to put the input shaft seal back on. Before we can do that, we need to put the bearing in. Each bearing is specific to the cone that it came out of. Now with the whole Racing Diffs kit, you're going to have a total of 4 bearings, and there's going to be 2 bigger ones that are a little bit thicker, and these are the ones that we're using right now for the differential case itself. The other 2 are going to be actually going onto those end caps. Now with the bearing in place, I'm putting the seal that was also included. You can match these up with the old ones, and I'm actually using the seals that they provided. They don't have a brand name on there. They're branded from Racing Diffs. Once again, I'm using my bearing tools to press them in. And you can also use the bearing cone to help you, or any other metal that you have laying around. Now with the cone, that big cone that we installed on the inside of the diff, we need to install the bearing that sits inside that cone onto the pinion itself. And you can always match up all of these bearings and cones the same way that you took them out. Now in order to put this bearing onto the actual pinion itself, you want to use certain things that actually don't touch the bearing collar, which is what's on the outside of it that allows it to spin. We only want to make contact on the inside of it, where that race is. Now we don't want to forget this new crush sleeve that's also included with the Racing Diffs kit, and we're also going to lubricate the input shaft itself, or the input flange itself. We're going to set that on the top of the differential, because now the pinion needs to be pressed into the bearing that's in there that's underneath that input flange. So we're going to take it back to the press, we're going to flip it over, we're going to use the input flange as the stopper. That way the actual bearing itself does not move around. Now that input flange is perfectly fine because it's actually making contact with the bearing itself, and it's not going to allow it to be pushed too much. Now we're going to use a variety of bearing tools to get it pressed in and the press, and you want to keep checking for the amount of free play that you have. You want to get it down tight enough where there's not too much free play, but there's still a little bit, because we're actually going to use the nut to push everything together and set that preload. So I just tightened it down. It's a 32 millimeter nut. Now we have to check the resistance, the rotational resistance. We want this to be 0.6 to 0.8 Newton meters. For this, I just used a 1/4 inch drive torque wrench, a beam style torque wrench. That way I can see exactly where that resistance is at. Now this is a 1/4 inch one because it measures in inch pounds and Newton meters. There's not a lot of torque wrenches that do this. You can find one like this at even O'Reilly, a lot of local auto parts store, or I'll have one linked down below from Amazon. And it is going to have to get tight. You want to tighten it very, very slowly, because if you tighten it too much, you can't back it off, because that sleeve that we put in is going to get crushed. So if we end up tightening it too much, there's too much resistance. If we go to pull it back off, that sleeve is not going to decompress at all. So we're going to have premature wear in the long run. With the proper resistance in place, now we can put the dust cap back on. If you're reusing the dust cap, you might have to straighten it out a little bit, and then we're going to press it all the way in against the nut, and then we're going to actually use a punch to spread it out into those 2 holes that are there for it to stay in place. Moving on to the end caps. Now once again, you want to make sure you don't lose the shim that goes with each end cap, and these are going to have the same kind of bearings and cones. So we're going to press the new cones in place. We're going to use the press again. Make sure everything is still labeled, because you don't want to mix up the shims especially. The cones themselves are going to be identical, but I like to keep the cone with the bearing that it came with. We're using the press and using those bearing tools once again, and we're just going to push it all the way in until it bottoms out. We're also going to use the old cone to make sure it goes all the way in and bottoms out. The bearings that go with each one of those side caps are going to go onto the actual carrier itself. So once again, make sure you still have the right ones in the right spot. The ring gear is on the driver's side. And when you're pressing these bearings in, once again, you want to make sure you're only pressing on the race and not the collar. So even with all the pressure on there, the bearing should still be able to spin even with us pressing it in. Now, when we're pressing the other side in, same thing. You want to put something down underneath it. That way it's only contacting the race. So the lower bearing should still be able to spin. And as you're pressing this new bearing in, that should also be able to spin, because we're only making contact with the race. Now we've got all the bearings placed in. We're going to put the new seals on the side caps, the end caps. Now I do use a little bit of Curil T2. You probably saw that earlier on the other seal as well. I put it on the outside of the flange just for any pitting or anything that might be there, just from how old all of these things are. So the new seals are also going to need to be pressed in. These don't fully bottom out, so you kind of want to see where the mark was from before, and you want to make sure it's going in straight and get it to sit in the right spot. So we just use the marks from before and push it into that exact location. We can finally reassemble this entire differential now. So we're going to put the whole carrier assembly in, make sure you have it oriented the right way. Since this is the V1 diff, the ring gear is on the driver's side. And make sure the end caps and the shims that go with the end caps are in the right spot. Before we reinstall it though, I am going to replace this O-ring that goes on the end cap that helps it seal. And on this seal, you can use either some differential fluid, the same Motul 75W140, or you can use some Curil T2 around that O-ring to help it seal. Now, one thing that's very important is there is a hole on each one of these end caps. You want that hole to be pointed toward the top of the diff, because it is an oiling hole that puts oil onto that bearing. Now, with all these 13mm bolts that go on the end cap, there's 2 bolts that go into the case. So the 2 bolts closest to the back of the differential, you want to get some kind of sealant on there. I'm just using the Curil T2 and installing those in. When you're tightening all these bolts, you kind of want to go in a star pattern. There isn't an official torque spec for these side cap bolts, but you do want to get them as tight as you can and just don't go overboard. So we had started with the passenger side for no particular reason. Now we're going to go on the driver's side. One other thing that you want to be sure of is make sure everything is clean and all of the bearings are lubricated. So once again, we're replacing that O-ring on the other end cap. With the new O-ring on, I coat it with some Curil T2. I also make sure that the cone that's for that bearing is also nice and clean and lubricated. and then we're going to make sure the oil hole is pointed towards the top of the diff as we reinstall this end cap. And of course, don't forget the shim. You can actually just use a mallet and push them in. They don't need to go, clockwise, counterclockwise or nothing. It should just seal and push all the way through, and the bolts are going to pull it in the rest of the way. Once again, on this side as well, you have the 2 bolts that need to have some kind of sealant on it, and you'll actually see those bolt holes come through the case for those 2 bolts all the way towards the back of the differential. Now, I like to lube up the actual oil seals before I insert the shaft. That way it just makes it a little bit easier to get in. I also put some differential fluid on the actual shaft itself on the splines. And then you just use a mallet to push them in. The clip will lock it in place. And it's the same thing for the passenger side. Once again, the passenger side shaft is shorter than the driver side shaft. Now you can actually check to see how everything spins. There should be no kind of binding. It is going to be more difficult to spin the output shafts, so the left and right, versus the input shaft. Now, as far as putting the diff case back on, you can actually re-oil some of these bearings and whatnot. I'm not going to fill it up too much because I don't want it to leak out of the seal. Now, I am using a new paper seal, but I also coated that paper seal with that Curil T2 on both sides to kind of make up for any pitting on any of the areas. And I went ahead and put all of the bolts in place. The paper gasket held the bolts, and these are all, once again, 16mm bolts. They're different sizes. The 2 longest ones go on the bottom, then the next longest ones go right on top of that, then the next longest ones go right on top of that, and then the shortest ones go at the very top. Now, the torque spec for all these bolts, I believe, is 45 Newton meters. I'll have a whole torque spec guide in the description down below. Just like that, we have a fully refurbed, rebuilt differential. Now we just got to reinstall it. The reinstallation is basically the opposite of removal. We want to angle the diff in, so we're going to put the input shaft, angle that in. You're going to need a buddy or just a lift of some sort to help you get in there. I actually cut off the zip ties that I had holding the half shafts. That way I can get that diff lined up. With the diff lined up, I actually put the back 2 bolts in first, hand tight, and you're going to torque these down last. You don't want those tightened up at all. You just want them hand tight. And then I used a pry bar and some blocks of wood to line up the front diff bolt. On the front diff bolt, I used a Nordlock washer. I'll have that link down below. This is very important. And I also put a little bit of red Loctite on the tip of the bolt. And I even used a brand new bolt that I got from Fastenal. I'll have all this stuff linked down below. This bolt is now a 22mm bolt. The reason I used a new one is because someone had previously kind of stripped a couple of the threads. So we got this tightened and we torqued it down to 128 foot-pounds with the Nordlock washer. Now we can reinstall the rest of the accessories that bolt onto the differential. We're going to start off with the half shafts on each side. I cleaned up the bolts. I even put a little bit of blue Loctite on each one of these bolts and then reinstall them. These are external Torx 12. With the half shafts torqued down, now we are on to the sway bar itself. I reinstalled the sway bar link brackets onto the spring perches or the upper control arms first. There's a 17mm bolt with a 13mm nut, 2 on each one of these upper control arms or spring perches, whatever you want to call them. Once those are fully installed, then I installed the back of the actual sway bar mounts to the subframe, and this is just held in with 2 hex bolts on each side. On to the drive shaft. I replaced the center support bearing. I also replaced the centering bushing that's on the front of the drive shaft, and then added some grease to the rear of the drive shaft. The drive shaft bolts on the rear are external Torx 12. These are going to be silver as opposed to the half shaft bolts. You're going to have 6 of these with the actual spacer or bracket, whatever you want to call it, in between. Once again, these are E12. We're going to get all of those installed. The front of the drive shaft that goes to the transmission, those are going to be 18mm bolts with 18mm nut on the other end. And this will be a good time to replace that flex joint or guibo, whatever you want to call it, if yours was messed up. With all that done, now we can reinstall the actual brace that goes in the front of the subframe bolts. This is just going to be held in with two 18mm nuts, and then we're going to have four 13mm bolts. You want to put these 13mm bolts before you tighten those 18mm nuts. So get all of those hand tight, and then we're going to torque down the 18mm nuts before we torque down the 13mm bolts. Don't forget to tighten the center support bearing nuts, two 13mm nuts, before you put the heat shield on. And you want to preload that center support bearing by pushing the actual mount itself towards the front of the car just a little bit. I'll have that in the description down below as well. With the heat shield in place, that's just held with 10mm bolts, 4 of them. Then we have the bracket that goes on the driver's side of the subframe that protects that bushing from the heat from the exhaust. That's held in with two 10mm bolts. And then we have the exhaust itself. Once the exhaust is fully installed, then we can put this rear brace in place, which is held in with three 16mm bolts. Now we're on to the final step, which is refilling the differential with all of the new fluid. We're going to use that same fluid we were using for lubing everything up while we were rebuilding it. It's the Motul 75W140. It's going to take about 1.2, 1.3 quarts. So you are going to need 2 bottles of this. So we got the diff and everything back in the car. It's really late at night, so I'm probably not going to take it for a long test drive, but I am going to test drive it. We do want to let all of that fluid soak into the clutches. We do want to break it in a little bit slowly. We're not going to just go straight out and start doing burnouts. But I'm really curious to see how it sounds, because before, when it's cold, as soon as you start making a sharp turn, it doesn't even have to be fully sharp, it'll start making that grinding noise that's known for these E46 M3 limited slips. So I'm curious to see if that noise is still going to be there, and then can't wait to see how it is on the road. So it's been about 7 miles, almost 8 miles now that I've been driving the car, and it's definitely still howling a little bit, but that could just be from, you know, the clutches need to break in, and then also we have all of the poly bushings on the entire subframe, the diff bushings, all of them. So there's going to be some noise that comes through from that anyways, but it's definitely quieter than it was before. And then on top of that, there's no more clunk. So that free play with that conical shim that we put in definitely worked, because usually when you would shift into first gear or from first to second, it will clunk, even from second to third, and even on the downshift. So all of the clunk is completely gone. So now it's just going to be, I'm not sure if you could pick up on that whining or howling noise. So it's still there a little bit, but I'm sure it's already actually getting a little bit quieter than it was when we first left. So I think it might get quieter as it goes. We're just gonna have to give it some time, see how long these clutches last. We're not really tracking this car at all, but we do get on some spirited drives. So we will see. I'll update you guys as time goes on. Just watch this video. I'll comment on here with updates and possibly even make a video if there's anything that actually goes wrong. But I'm actually excited to see how long these last, these clutches, that whole conical shim, how long before the free play returns, because that conical shim eventually is gonna give, because the pressure that's on there is eventually gonna get flatter, and the free play, as my theory is going to return, but just not sure how long it's gonna take. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know it's a long video. There's a lot of stuff that we did in it. The whole rebuild took quite a bit. I'll have all of the tools, parts, everything used linked down below. If you guys have any questions, leave a comment down below. If you need some one-on-one help or diagnostic help, check out my website, www.shoplifetv.com. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.